All right, my name is Zach Howell. Today I'm going to be going over a technique analysis of the deadlift. We're going to talk about the biomechanical factors that influence a maximal attempt deadlift, and also we're going to take a look at um, the anatomical factors that affect the deadlift and where we see rapid moments of acceleration, as well as where we're likely to get injured and why we might be injured there. So before we get into that, though, we have to kind of define what a deadlift is and what the purpose of it is. So the deadlift, we have two types, conventional and sumo. Both of these are heavily used in the powerlifting sector. For this, we're going to talk about conventional deadlift. That's my favorite. So we're going to talk about the conventional deadlift. This is a closed chain movement, meaning that the feet stay in contact with the ground. The start position is on the ground. There is no eccentric phase, so you'll see some powerlifters, they try to get some kind of eccentric phase in. They'll grab the bar, they'll get down their stance, and then they'll push the bar away, and then they'll pull it back in and drop their butt down, right? They'll drop their hips, and then they'll start to extend, so that way they can kind of get a small loading effect. But for the most part, you're just starting from the ground and picking it up. We're looking at multi-joint, multiple muscle groups, total body. It's not just a lower body exercise. It's going to require core strength. It's also going to require mid and upper back strength in order to keep you from toppling over. So we'll go into more depth on this, but here are your agonists and synergists, the things that mainly move this: glutes, hamstrings, quads. We also have our gastrocs and soleus and our erector spinae. They are going to help us get this bar going. Our antagonists, they're really going to stabilize us here and work to keep from, like I said, the bar toppling over. That's going to be our rector abdominis and our obliques. And then we have more stabilizers in the upper back with our rhomboids, upper and mid traps, levator scapula, and our lats. Okay? So, just the simple purpose: pick the bar up off the ground and replace it to the ground in a controlled manner. I specifically, especially for athletic movements, I try to get everybody, just for discipline's sake, to control the bar back to the ground, especially whenever you're tired. It also is going to keep you a little bit longer time under tension and make you stronger that way. So that being said, I love this quote from Eddie Hall. He said it in a YouTube video right before, well, not right before, but a video on his record-breaking attempt at the half-ton deadlift. He said, "The deadlift is the truest test of strength because you can't cheat it." I'm sure that someone can figure out a way to cheat it, but I understand what he's saying is, like, once you grab the bar, like, you just have to lift it off the ground. There is no, oh, did he squat all the way down? Did he hit, parallel? Or, oh, did his arms lock out on an overhead press? No, it's either you stood up with it or you didn't. So the deadlift purpose, like I said, we're talking about a maximal load deadlift. So the purpose of the deadlift is to pull a maximal load off the ground to a standing position with the hips, knees, and spine fully extended and the body in an upright position, and then control the weight back to the ground. So I'm not just going to drop it once I get to the top. I'm going to replace it. So this is what we're looking at. This is Brian Shaw's attempt at the Arnold, I believe. Or is this World? This is World. Right there at the very top, everything was in full extension. So that's what we're looking at. So first, let's talk about the theoretical model of biomechanical factors. So there are multiple biomechanical factors that affect this max attempt deadlift. A lot of people think it's super simple, get down and stand up, but there are a lot of factors that go into this. But there are mainly three, and those three act upon two bodies or two implements. So we have force or torque, displacement, and velocity. And really what these are affecting are the bar and then our muscles, right? So force is applied through the ground. It's also applied to the bar, but also it's applied through the moment arms of the muscles of the hips, knees, back, and wrists in order to produce torque to not just lift the bar up, but also to stabilize and also to keep the bar from falling out of our hands. Okay, displacement, obviously we're looking at displacement of the bar, okay, but also the displacement of the hips and knees, because this is going to affect our angular velocity, which is going to affect our torque. Do a regression of equations. So the thing is, if your displacement of the bar, if the bar has to go longer, if your hips and knees have to displace across a greater amount of time, that's going to essentially affect your velocity, right? So a greater displacement over a greater amount of time is going to affect your velocity. If your displacement, see, that what we have to remember is there is a relationship between force and velocity as well. All three of these are connected. And whenever we apply a great force to the bar, that means our velocity is going to be slow. And so we don't want to slow that down even more with the displacement of the bar, right? So we want to make sure we're in the right stance and the bar is moving along the right path. Velocity, obviously, how fast are we positively moving this bar, which is going to affect multiple things, like I said, of the bar. It's going to affect our sticking point. Whenever we get to the knee pass, there's going to be a point that's going to, it's just known as a sticking point. We'll talk about that here in a second. And then also the velocity of our hips and knees. Like I said, the displacement of the hips and knees affects the velocity, our angular velocity, right? Which is going to affect our angular momentum and our torque, our net torque, right? And our impulse. So this right here is the giant web of biomechanical factors. We're going to take these and break them down here right now. So the bar, that's first, right? It's easier. We talk about displacement. Distance the bar travels throughout the lift occurs from the ground to the mid-thigh or just below the belt line. Okay? Depends how long your arms are. We want the shortest distance. Okay? So that's why we pull this bar as close to the body as we can. It's mechanically efficient, going to keep you from getting injured, but also think about it. If I have that bar over my midfoot, then it's just coming straight up right along the anterior of my tibia, anterior of my quads. If I let that bar, before I lift it, if I drift it out over my toes, now not only am I mechanically inefficient, but I have to pull that bar back into myself, meaning a greater displacement, a greater change in time, and a slower velocity. So that's obviously not good, but that's why we want to make sure that we are in the right stance and we're pulling the bar perfect path. Even if we get, right to knee pass and we bring it out and around our knees, well, we've lengthened our displacement, right? This, like I said, is going to affect the velocity. This is the displacement over the change in time. And bar velocity slows at this sticking point where there's a shift in the moment arm. And I don't mean the moment arm changes from one thing to another, but our moment arm runs through, so our center of mass obviously right about the hip, and the shorter, there are two ways this moment arm can go. The shorter goes down through the bottom of our hips, right? That's if we produce enough force through that posterior chain, then we can get this bar off the ground. The longer goes from our hips all the way up through our spine, okay, where again I'm using those shoulder muscles and the upper back muscles to stabilize where I'm using that to stabilize the bar, right? So with that being said, as I stand up, as I come up, and now I'm getting to the knee pass, so now my hips need to come through, so my body begins to straighten. Now I'm having to utilize different muscles to keep that bar tied to my body, right? If I don't keep that bar tied to my body as I stand up and I let it drift out, away from my body, like I said, people they like to use their hips and drive the bar around. That's not good. That's going to affect my velocity, and it's actually going to slow me down. And if velocity hits 0, then that means that we're stuck. We're failed attempt. Because the bar has to stay moving. Most powerlifting leagues say that. Or if it starts to become negative, since it is a vector, that means obviously we're dropping the bar now. So velocity has to stay constant or increase, or honestly just needs to slow down the slowest, but it cannot come to an absolute stop. So whenever we hit that knee pass, we have to be able to create more angular velocity in our hips to push our hips through, right? And therefore get a greater impulse, greater angular momentum, and get that bar all the way through. So let's talk about force applied to the bar. So the weight must be overcome by ground contact force, is what we're putting into the ground, right? So forces are generated by an impulse, and this has a relationship with momentum, right? It's actually very similar to the force velocity curve that I referenced earlier, where if we have a greater force, so force affects the impulse. It's the net change in force over change in time, right? And momentum is the mass over change in velocity. So most likely what's going to happen here is this right here, mass is not going to change. So that's not going to change the momentum. What's going to change our momentum is the velocity, right? So, well, force and velocity have this relationship where if a force is extremely high, extremely great, this velocity is going to be low. So that's what I'm saying is, as long as this doesn't hit zero, though, we're overcoming this mass, which therefore, obviously, the impulse is great enough to cause a change in momentum, right? So that's what we need. Can't let this hit zero. And linear momentum is extremely important, obviously, because we want to pull that bar in a vertical, linear fashion. We don't want it to, like I said, we don't want it to come away from our body. We don't want to start away and then pull in. When an impulse is placed on an object, momentum shifts. They are dependent on the velocity of this bar and the amount of force that we put on the bar. So if the force applied is not great enough to overcome this, right, the weight, which is the mass times acceleration due to gravity. So if our force, the mass and the acceleration that we send upwards vertically, is not great enough, there's not going to be an impulse, because there's not going to be a change in velocity at all. It's going to remain zero. So that's why it's essential to get in the proper stance and be able to get that bar off the ground, get it going fast enough. There's also a relationship with force that results in work. And what we want to do is we actually want to preserve that amount, the amount of work. So that's actually going to cause us to expend less energy, and I'll explain. So work is force times displacement. Again, displacement, we want a bar to travel in as short a path as possible, produce as much force as we possibly can in order to get the thing off the ground. But if we're doing less work, that means that we have less of a change in energy, means less energy is expended, yes, said that correctly, is spent. Which means that we've preserved some energy, right? And that means that, maybe we can go back and make another attempt later. So shorter displacement gives us the advantage, and it's more energy efficient. But what helps us apply the force to the bar? Obviously, we're going to say muscles, right? So we're going to talk about torque now. So force comes in handy right here with torque. It's force times the moment arm. It's the angular analog of force. Produced in muscles about a moment arm. So like I said, our moment arm is at the hip, and we have a moment arm, that's our axis, right? And then our radius is however far that that implement, that bar, is acting through, perpendicular through the axis. So if the axis starts at our hip and extends through our head and spine and all the way down through our hips, then at the bottom of the hips, the distance from the bottom of the hips to the center of mass is shorter, to the bar is going to be shorter, right? Whereas the distance that goes up through our spine is going to be longer. So really, we are very dependent. This is why we're dependent on those glutes, hamstrings, and lower body muscles to break the ground.